Hi everyone, it's William on a hot August afternoon, 13th of August 2025, a Wednesday, and I'm feeling ambitious today. I am going to try and do the entire essay, I guess is more accurate than article, that Dmitri wrote for the Young Russia Spark, Iskra, the publication of the party. And it's not long, but it's long for us. But yeah, a lot of it doesn't really need comment, so we'll see how that goes. Our recap, yesterday's video, we were in 1915 and we had Dmitri leaving Moscow after only one night there. He and Maria leaving for Petrograd. And our last 1935 video, which was an address that Dmitri made on the feast day of the Young Russia Party. Basically, there were two emphases, and there are throughout these, and even going back to 1921 with Dmitri. One is the desire to remain connected to Russia, even though Russia is now the Soviet Union, to remain engaged with Russia, and to continue to look at Russia as Russia, despite the Soviet regime. The other is an orientation toward the younger generation and toward the future, rather than looking to the past, spending all one's time in sort of a nostalgic state of reminiscence without any action, and disregarding Russia as it now existed, as no longer Russia but the Soviet Union. Okay, so that was the thing that so Dmitri wanted this orientation toward the future and was against the other alternative. Today we have for our cast Kazanbek, Alexander Kazanbek, the leader of the Young Russia Party, and we have a literary reference to Ivan Turgenev, and I bring that up right from the start because Dmitri has entitled his essay Fathers and Children, which is the title of what is perhaps Turgenev's, I think it definitely is Turgenev's most famous book, called Fathers and Children, Ati Dieti, often translated as Fathers and Sons, because it's dealing with two sets of parents and their sons. But the literal translation is Dieti, which means son, children, not Sinovia, which means sons. So that was Dmitri's chosen title. He puts fathers and sons in quotes. The essay was published in the Young Russian Spark on 25th August 1935, so not long after, apparently, the feast day speech. And the title is in keeping with Young Russia's consistent use of names that come from other sources, and surprisingly from the revolutionary movement in Imperial Russia. Turgenev was not a revolutionary, but he was certainly a liberal. And we'll talk about that a little later. Okay, here we go. Try to squeeze this all in. Here's Dmitri. Over the past 9 years, I have followed the Young Russia movement very closely and watched from the beginning as it grew into what it is now, the Young Russia Party. I was in constant close contact with A.L. Kazanbek, the founder and head of the movement, and with those young Russians who were, at that time, already his closest assistants. From the very beginning, I saw and felt that this was the sole patriotic movement destined to connect the future of our motherland to its great past. But at that time, I was still standing on the sidelines, consciously not taking an active part in what was then a young movement. I wanted to test not only the aspirations of the movement, but my own personal attitude toward it. I was not disappointed. On the contrary, the ideas and outlook of the Young Russians corresponded completely with my own. I reached a deep realization that I needed to play an active part in the work of the Young Russia movement, and at the request of the head, took upon myself the chairmanship of the main council of the Young Russia Party. Ironically, generational differences are one of the main reasons why the Young Russia movement has come to exist. I refer to the psychological difference between fathers and children. The fathers, the older generation, lived in Russia and saw firsthand the old Russian life. The younger generation knows only the horrors of the years between 1918 and 1920, and for that reason has detached itself from what the fathers see as the dear past. Dear past is in quotes. It was, however, impossible to nourish our young people only on the things that served the glory and greatness of Russia in the past. Indeed, very often the young people of that period were forbidden, or at any rate not encouraged, to love Russia, i.e. as it is now. For people of the older generation who remembered Russia and served her before the revolution, Russia, in the aftermath of the revolution, simply ceased to exist. That sorry psychological state could not satisfy our youth. Young people could not reconcile themselves to the idea that Russia supposedly no longer existed. In the vast majority of cases, not having known Russia in the past but being in constant contact with Russian people abroad, these youngsters naturally began to realize their intrinsic love for Russia. From our Russian point of view, that phenomenon was completely understandable because our youth, torn away from their country, despite their long sojourn abroad, cannot find a purpose for themselves outside the fatherland, much less inner contentment. This is where one of the merits of the Young Russia movement comes to light. We've given the new generation the opportunity to believe in Russia. We've given them the right to acknowledge themselves as Russians. We've given them a reason to look ahead with boldness and confidence instead of just joining the older generation in mourning a past that is dear to them, but incomprehensible to our youth. Having outpaced, as it were, the patriotic thinking of the immigration, neither I nor the young Russians can ever go back. We are all sincere patriots and fervently love Russia, to which we are boundlessly devoted, but we do not confuse Russia with her current regime. Our strength lies precisely in the fact that we have been able to breathe fresh new hope into the younger generation, explaining to them that there, in the distant motherland, Russian people like themselves live and often suffer, constantly burning with a single aspiration, a single hope to give our lives to the motherland, which is not yet familiar to all of us. We young Russians have the right and opportunity to proudly and clearly call ourselves Russians again. This is the basis of our strength, and that is the end. And it's all very well said, isn't it? And there's a lot of truth in it. And if anybody ever tries to convince you that Dmitri was a dimwit or was not engaged with his country and with Russia, and that he wasn't a person who could, make cultural references, a person who didn't, that he was a person who didn't know literature, that he was a person who didn't think at a sophisticated level. Well, here I would in particular point not just to the Turgenev book, and any of you who watched the 1906 diary videos know that he was reading Turgenev when he was 14, and that he was reading things that had to do with Russia's social evolution, so to speak, things that the most conservative-minded people would have disapproved of. But he was being given those things to read, and he wanted to read those things. Anyway, okay, that's enough of that. Oh, well, not quite, because I also wanted to point out that, he's talking about, he's using terms like the evolution. In a previous speech, he was talking about the evolution and development of the Russian people. He's talking about, here he uses the word psychological state. And he was not, not only was he not a dimwit, he was not an unsophisticated person. Okay. Yeah, so we've talked about Turgenev's fathers and children, and that's, very aptly brought up here because it's about the generation gap specifically. And let's bear in mind that Dmitri had a little boy at this point, and it would have concerned him. I've never met an immigrant family yet that isn't concerned about what kind of relationship their children or child will have with their language, with their culture. So yeah, I'm sure it was personally concerning to him. He tells us that he's been watching Young Russia for 9 years, so that would make it 1926. That he started earlier, I think he told us that he'd been to some extent involved with the movement since 1923, or at least maybe he didn't say involved. I need to relook at that. Maybe just familiar with it, which is when he took the position as Kirill's representative, or sort of the head of his chancery in France. Okay. He always liked the concept of bridging things. You may remember that from when he was an adolescent. He was always trying to sort of be the mediator between different parties. For instance, when Laming was fighting with Aunt Maria Georgievna, Dmitri would always feel responsible for putting himself in the middle of such things as, trying to bring the sides together. That was very, very genuine in him, probably because of his childhood, and now, and especially also in 1938, 1939, he's trying to bridge the gap between not only the generations, as he mentions here, but also the political ends of the spectrum within the immigration. So, and in this instance, he's talking about building a bridge between the Imperial Russian past and whatever the future of Russia would be. Okay, and when he says that he found that Young Russia ideals corresponded to his own, that's another thing that's absolutely accurate. In fact, reading the 1921 diaries before Young Russia even existed, he's already talking about these ideas of looking to the future, and and realizing that the Russia of the future will not be just a return to the past, but will have new ideas that have to be respected. Okay, this is interesting here when he's saying that young people need to have a purpose and inner contentment that the children of Russian emigres, in his assessment, don't have. They're torn between two worlds, and in his assessment, the best way to give them a purpose and inner contentment would be to give them this goal of being engaged with Russia and a part of whatever Russia's future will be. And that's probably true. I have had a lot of occasion, I've had the privilege in a lot of instances as an ESL teacher, as a historian, as a person from a multicultural family, of observing this scenario as it plays out with immigrants and then first generation, their children. So my sister-in-law is Lao, and her whole extended family are here, and my nieces and nephews are raised with struggling with that generation gap. The mixed we all have, our struggles with the generation gap, but the mixed struggle of a generation gap and the different culture that their parents were raised in. So, that's very personal to me. And also, the Russians in the U.S., my Russian friends in the U.S. whose children were born here, and the parents came as adults, and also in my Greek Orthodox parish, seeing, and as a person who taught Sunday school for 10 years, and seeing how the kids, being Greek is a big part of their identity, but not in the way necessarily that their parents would want it to be. And, with some of the Russian kids here, the first generation Russian kids, and with what's going on in Russia now, and how some of them would just as soon not speak Russian, or be involved with the Russian community, which is a pity. But you see it over and over again. And as a historian, I've worked with, I'm not old enough. I guess that's not unfortunate, although I would have loved to have met people who knew Dmitri personally as adults. I've only met people who knew him as children. But again, I've been surprised by how that generation gap and cultural gap sometimes plays out. I've been asked by children of immigrants, white Russian immigrants, why is your father or mother now telling me all of these things? Grandchildren in my case. Why is your father and mother now telling me all of these things that they never wanted to talk about? And I guess it's just because they're at a time in their lives when they're in their 70s, 80s, that they do want to talk to someone about it. But why was there this barrier in talking to their own kids about it? And, since they themselves, the grandparents, were first generation immigrants, were they not talking with their parents about it? I don't know, but it seems that there are these sort of just barriers that spring up that nobody talks about or thinks about, and you kind of sometimes need an outsider to break the ice with that. Okay, so as you can tell, that's a topic that's of interest to me personally, and one of the best things I've ever read on this topic, if any of you are also interested in it, is a book called At the Mind's Limits, it's called in English. The original is in French, I believe, written by Jean Amery, who was actually a German Jew who emigrated to Belgium during the Second World War, who was a Holocaust survivor. And there's an essay incorporated into the book called How Much Home Does a Person Need? And in that essay, he's talking about specifically what it's like to be an immigrant. And he distinguishes between different kinds of immigrants and says that it's especially hard if you're an immigrant who always considered himself, so in Amery's case, his father died in the First World War, so he didn't really know his father, and his mother was German. She wasn't Jewish. He was raised in completely ordinary German village life. And so for him to be in exile, it was particularly hurtful because he was thinking, well, I have been rejected. I've been rejected by my neighbors and by the community at large and by society at large. And that makes it particularly hard to be an immigrant. You've been kicked out. And in the case of the White Russians, that was true as well. Once they left their country, the Soviet Union, in I believe 1922, took the step of canceling their citizenship. They were no longer Russian citizens. They didn't even have that option. And some of them, of course, left voluntarily. They wanted to get out. They didn't want to undergo, they didn't want to be persecuted by the Bolsheviks. They didn't want any of that, but they went on their own, whereas in the case of the Romanovs, in the case of Dmitri, and in case of some of the intellectuals and artists and writers who were rounded up and deported, they were too famous to be killed off by the Soviets, so they were deported. They had wanted to stay in Russia, but they were never going to, they were always going to be critical. And in the case of Romanovs, of course, they were kicked out or killed, one or the other. And so they couldn't look at their native land, at Russia, and say, it was just the regime that kicked us out. I mean, they felt like it was, to some extent, less so than in the case of Amery, but, we can't go back. They'll kill us or put us in prison if we go back. We have really been rejected. And, was Amery right and was Dmitri right when they said, no, the people, which was right? Almery said, no, it was the people who rejected me. Dmitri said, no, it was the government who rejected me, not the people. And therefore, Russia is still Russia to me. And I still feel like part of it. So, to quote Amory, you need the consent of society. But if society repudiates, well, I'm paraphrasing, if society repudiates you or the group that you belong to, then he says they're repudiating. If they're repudiating that we ever were their countrymen, then we also have never been their countrymen. So that's how he felt about it, and he was in the most extreme possible case. But Dmitri as well. Amory lost so many of his friends and relatives, and he himself was a Holocaust survivor. And Dmitri lost, one huge section of his family, including the aunt who raised him, his father, his half-brother. Yeah, so there you go. So it's interesting that he wasn't taking that personally. I mean, he really wasn't in his case. And he wanted, to say that I'm still with the Russian people, I'm still with the Russian culture, but I can distinguish between that and the current regime. So is that justifiable? I don't know. Is the current regime a country? You could say, it was just Hitler, it was just so-and-so. In my case, I would say, yeah, Trump. I think you all know that I'm an anti-Trump person, an anti-fascism person. But then you ask yourself, is it justifiable to say, oh, well, it was Stalin or this or that? Doesn't it take the people to allow, at least passively, allow these sort of cults to come into existence? And, don't these cults come out of a building sort of bottom-down desire to bring these kind of bullying and racist and other things to the surface? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. I just think I would be less generous with it, maybe, than Dmitri, but maybe, I don't know. Each case is different. And in his case, certainly the peasants very early on realized that they had been bamboozled, that they had been lied to by the Bolsheviks, but by then there was no going back. Anyway, I shouldn't really make value judgments in these videos, but I always do. I like the way he puts that we want the young people to know that there are people, real people like themselves, who are living and often suffering. People like themselves live and often suffer in Russia, and he's absolutely right about that. And it does make a difference when you think about people as real people and not just theoretical or abstract. Again, this talking of giving our lives for the motherland. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, as I'm a little wary of whenever he uses the word sacrifice, giving our lives. Yeah, I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean we're all going to go and die, in the fight. I don't know if there were, I kind of doubt there were any White Russians who went back to the Soviet Union and volunteered to fight for the Soviets. Maybe there were, I just don't know of them. Dmitri was too old and too sick. He didn't have that option. And those people would have ended up, if they'd survived the war, they would have ended up in gulags. They would have been completely distrusted. They probably would have ended up in gulags from day one. But, it did make me think of this idea, of this Orthodox idea, specifically that I heard from Bishop Kallistos Ware, a great man, a great theologian, now deceased, unfortunately, who said martyrdom is the universal Christian vocation. So that does not mean giving your life in the literal sense, but it does mean, to me, as I interpret it, this idea of servanthood, of Christian servanthood, and I don't live up to that ideal. So, but it's not, as Ware was using it, it's not a fanatical idea. And so I don't know if Dmitri was using it in that sort of orthodox spirit, or, some elements of the party, as I said, it was or was beginning to be a fanatical idea. So we'll have time to talk about that later. Okay, next time in the next 1935 video, we will be on the road with Kazim Bek. You remember how in 1921 we were on the road with Coco. We had the road trip driving back from the south of France to Paris, stopping along the way. Well, Kazim Bek and Dmitri took this big road trip. Dmitri had been newly appointed, as you know, as the head of the sports organization within Young Russia, and also as the chairman of the party. And so, the time had come for him to get out there and be seen by Young Russia groups all over France. So they're going to make that kind of grand road trip. And we'll be hearing about that in a speech that he's going to be giving in Nice. Bear in mind at this time that his marriage was already falling apart. He refers to that in his 1935 diary, the fact that, the marriage is falling apart, and it's a source of great sadness and frustration for him. Okay, in 1915, in tomorrow's video, Dmitri had alluded earlier on to having purchased by proxy this Renault, this brand new car in Petrograd. So he's going to be able to enjoy his new car. He's going to be able to enjoy spending time at the yacht club, gambling there. And on that first day back to Petrograd, he and Maria are going to go off and have dinner with their father. And there will be an interesting group of people there having dinner at Grand Duke Paul's house as well. So, yeah, sorry I went so long. Maybe, clearly I should have broken this one into two, because I could talk even longer about all of these things that Dmitri is talking about. But thank you for your patience if you have now watched it to the very end, and I'll see you next time. Bye.